What class do you teach at Stanford?
I teach two classes. One is Gender, Culture, and HIV, which is a sophomore seminar, and it's Hum Bio. And I also teach Hum Bio 143 now, which is Adolescent Sexuality.
Okay. And could you talk a little bit about some of the controversial topics that have come up in class?
The nature of the Adolescent Sexuality class is that every topic is controversial. It's a 10-week class, and during that 10 weeks we talk about general adolescent development and policy related to that, including sex education and religion, availability of, say, over-the-counter emergency contraception, and then we talk about drugs and sex and date rape and sexual harassment. All of those issues are controversial. It doesn't really matter which week you pick. Any of those topics you could create as a controversial subject. I think that probably the biggest ones from the perspective you want to take today about science and spirituality would be masturbation, birth control, premarital sex, and sex education. Those are probably the four biggest. Most people agree that sexual coercion is wrong, sexual harassment is wrong. Very few spiritual leaders will take those on and say that that they're acceptable. So the big four controversies would be those.
And your class falls under human biology?
Yes.
Okay. So it's considered like a science?
Yes.
Okay.
It's considered, human biology tries to integrate science and social science. So in the class we cover both.
Okay. And have you encountered, I guess, challenges or resistance from conservative Christians for your class?
So I've never experienced any, quote, resistance to the class.
Okay.
Every year, well, actually maybe not in your year, most years I have at least one parent who comes in, who happens to be in town for parent weekend or whatever, and who comes with their kid. I get lots of parental emails every year from students who go home and want to talk about certain subjects with their families. A lot of cultural issues come up. For example, female genital mutilation will come up, and several students have found out that their mothers actually had experienced it, and it was a surprise to them. So they come back and the moms want to talk, and there's lots of controversial stuff, brings lots of dialogue, but never any, quote, resistance. Every year there are also students in the class who I would call conservative students, and fortunately or unfortunately, those students tend to be kind of quiet in the class because the majority of students, or the students who tend to be the most outspoken, are not the conservative students. So pretty quickly it's clear from their questions and the books they choose and to watch and the movies they bring into class that they are conservative. Many of them will try and bring religion in, and it's the rules of the class, as you know, are that all views are tolerated, so nobody is not allowed to talk. But I think it's harder for the students who are the most conservative to actually bring things to the table, in part because I tend to veer to the left no matter how hard I try to walk in the middle, and that there are pretty outspoken students in that class every year from also the left. Although every year I have to say the book and movie lists get more and more Christian-oriented or conservative-oriented materials on them. And they're not ones that tend to come into my life, but the students will bring them in. So now there are books on religion and sexuality, whereas 5 years ago they probably weren't.
Now, I was wondering if you could discuss some of the issues that wherein like kind of sexual education comes to a head with maybe some religious or spiritual views?
My pleasure. This is the era of the Bush administration. I could get in a lot of trouble here. So usually
Okay.
in class, these kinds of perspectives don't come out. So I'll say this to you, but I wouldn't say it in class. Sex education is a great example because the science of what we know about sexuality education and how it's taught in schools is all really clear. Abstinence-only education does not work. We know that the pledges do not work. That students who take the pledge to maintain their virginity until they're married have sex just as often as kids who do not take the pledge. But the kids who took the pledge are more likely not to use any birth control and condoms their first time. So they are actually at higher risk. We also know that abstinence-based education creates students who are less likely to use birth control and condoms, therefore, again, more at risk. Whereas students who experience comprehensive sex ed, which means it not only talks about abstinence, but it also talks about birth control methods, and hopefully does some skill building around negotiating safer sex and using birth control, that students who go through comprehensive sex ed are more likely to use condoms and have safer sex. They are not more likely to have sex. So our population of adolescents are out there having sex at about the same rates, no matter what sex ed they're getting. There are things that we know keep kids from initiating sex early. Those are parental involvement, involvement with sports and music and community service, anything that's keeping them busy, having parental monitoring, parental involvement, having parents who are very clear about the expectations they have that their kids will not participate in sex. We do know there are things that contribute to kids not initiating sex, but sex ed, whether it's comprehensive and abstinence-based, is not one of them. And so for the Bush administration to continue to pump billions of dollars into, millions maybe, to abstinence-based education is just flying in the face of science. And it doesn't seem to matter how many good studies get presented, they still ignore them. And it's religious dogma winning out over science.